guess, everyone. Thanks for staying around. Great day today. A lot of really dynamic speakers, a lot of really good content. Hopefully I can keep up to par. It said selling to China, I think, was the topic. I changed that a tad, and I say, this is really a session about how we think about the China market and what it may mean or may not mean for you. And I'm just going to try to impart as much information as possible in the next 25, 30 minutes. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm not Chinese, so what would I know about the China market? So I thought I would just tell you a little bit about our experience. I've been living full-time in Beijing for approximately 11 years. I had moved to Beijing. My wife's not Chinese either. She's from the Midwest. But we moved to Beijing in end of 2006, beginning of 2007, with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old girls. We had our youngest one there in 2008 during the Olympics. She's now 9. We're now in the process of repatriating to the US. I still run our business in Beijing. The rest of my team is in Beijing. We made the unfortunate move today, I can say unfortunate, to move to Montecito. So we've been living in a hotel the last couple of weeks. Family's all fine, everything's good, but quite an eye-opener to move back to that environment. Kind of funny side story there is my 9-year-old daughter, coming from a large international school where everyone spoke multiple languages. She comes back to Santa Barbara, to Montecito, and says, you know, Dad, there's only 2 foreign students in my class, one girl from Germany and me from China. So, we're a small firm. We have 3 principals, myself, my business school classmate, his name is Tony Yang, or Yang Kun. He's from Beijing, multiple generations. We went to business school in Beijing in 2007. Our other partner is Chinese, American-born Chinese, ABC, as opposed to my daughter who's a CBA, China-born American. He is a US MD. He became a venture capitalist, and then he ran his parents' medical device factory outside of Beijing for about 9 years. So we collectively have a lot of experience. When people say, what is it that we do, the way I like to describe it is we become the on-the-ground team or on-the-ground assets for a small US medical device company who should be in China but won't get there anytime soon. So our entire team's on the ground. We're in Beijing because that's where the capital is, that's where the CFDA is, and we run operations from there. We've been operating now for 9 years. I went to Beijing with a different company, which failed unspectacularly, and I found myself in China with a couple young daughters not knowing what to do. I saw some medical device companies, which is the background I come from, that were in trouble in China, so we started off doing workout. To date, we've helped over 90 US medical device companies in the market, and that number continues to grow. So one of the most important things that we did early on was we got our license from the CFDA, the Chinese FDA, to be able to perform the role of an importer of medical devices, class 1, class 2, class 3, and also to sell and market those and be the legal agency for US medical devices in China. We've subsequently expanded our scope of license so we can handle all operations for imported medical devices. We primarily just work with US companies because of the cultural connect. So an example of some of the things that we've done, we've helped bring a one-product company in the China market from 0 to 10 million in revenue to the US company, which was about, I want to say 25% of their revenue at the time that they were acquired. We've helped companies do cross-border investments, so we've helped Chinese companies invest into US to invest and acquire Chinese assets. We're not an investment bank, we just help as consultants on the ground in China, deal size from 3 million to 15 million US. We've made direct investments ourselves, both on the China side and the US side in medical device companies of up to $1 million. We are now helping a number of US companies, a handful of US companies, do sourcing and do manufacturing in China to support both their China operations, so they have a reduced cost of goods, as well as the rest of world operations. And for a handful of companies, we're also accelerating their market entry. So we're investing into their market entry into the China market. So Is China worth the effort? We heard earlier today it's a big market and it's growing. It's the second largest marketplace for medical devices right now after the US. Projections are that it will surpass the US in the coming 5 years. So when we first started, we used to have to try to convince people that China was an important market. That was 8, 9 years ago. Now, we have conversations where a lot of people believe we need to be there now. How do we get there? It's largest by market opportunity. By that, I mean the government is spending a significant amount of money to increase the per capita spend on healthcare. There's a lot of issues with the healthcare market in the US. There's different issues with the healthcare market in China. They know they need to spend more money, so there's a lot of money going into the market. We saw earlier 10% growth rate. I've seen it vary between 10 to 20% growth rate over the last 9 to 10 years. Most of the analysts are projecting that will continue for the coming 5 to 10 years as well. One of the challenges about the China market, though, is that it's never staying the same. It's always changing. And we've run across opportunities that if the company had started today, let's say, take that back 3 years. If they had started 3 years ago when they were evaluating it, they would have been very successful. They waited a year, everything changed, no longer made sense. So one of the most difficult things that we have to do is look at technologies who are interested in getting into the China market and evaluate whether or not now is the right time and what it looks like going forward. 2, 3, 4 years out, 5 years out, will it still be a good market for them? China's also hard because it's a very different culture. We think about things differently. It's a different language. It's a long ways away. It's not easy to do the travel. Business practices are also different, but having an understanding of what the cultural differences are, what the business practice differences are, is really important to having a successful relationship in China. I have to tell a lot of companies that no, even though you love your product, it's your baby, and you're doing great in the US, it's not the right product for China. It also, in some cases, it's not the right place for the leadership of the company to pursue, just because of a mismatch or imbalance between what they're interested in and what they can actually achieve in the China market. Relationships, guanxi in Chinese, are super important. We run into a lot of companies who've made their first trip to China. Maybe they made a second trip to China. Maybe they've met some potential partners at device conferences, and after 1 or 2 meetings, they're pretty sure that they have a deal and it's going to work out. It may. Usually it takes a lot more than that. It takes a lot of time spent together. There's a saying, trust, then verify. In China, we typically say verify, then trust. So you make sure that after multiple meetings, you're hearing the same things. You're asking the same questions, you're getting the same answers, and you're spending a lot of time together. I think that probably the most important piece of advice that I could give to anyone who's thinking about the China market is that thinking through what the various potential strategies are, what your risk-reward profile are at getting into a new market and a foreign market and a market that's a long ways away that you have little control over, it's an analysis that can be, it's not a back of the napkin type of analysis, but it's something that you need to spend time and energy on and understand all the nuances of it. So there's always concerns about China. So I'm going to ask a question. What's the concern about China? Doing business in China, going to China, selling your products in China, partnering with a Chinese distribution company, manufacturer. What are you concerned about? The fact that they don't seem to honor intellectual property. Every single conversation we have, that comes up. Yeah. What else? Anything else? Just IP? Languages, yeah, and the languages is actually a really good point because being in meetings all the time with English speakers and Chinese speakers and understanding enough of the Chinese language and listening to the translations aren't necessarily what the actual meaning or intent of the statement was, so it becomes really messy. especially when you get into M&A deals, and then you've got lawyers on both sides, and they're speaking different languages, and the translators or interpreters are trying to smooth over the conversations, but they're also altering the language a little bit. It's super challenging. So I wrote a couple. They don't value our IP, so that's number one. Ding, ding, ding. We'll get copied. A little bit different than protect the IP, because let me talk about the IP first. I would say the advice from law firms 5+ years ago for companies who didn't have a lot of resources were don't worry about protecting your IP in China because they don't value your IP in China. That's changed. And the reason that has changed is because at a macro level, the Chinese government does not want to be the manufacturing hub of the world anymore. And they want to move back to innovation and stimulating innovation and having entrepreneurs innovate. And so in order to do that, they have to protect innovation. And they're protecting innovation more and more every year. And it's not to the level of the protections that we have in the US with our legal system, but it's getting better. More importantly, if you don't protect your IP in China, then you're not going to find a partner who wants to work with you because you'll get copied, because you haven't protected it. Brings to the second point, you'll get copied. If you don't go to China and you have a really great product, you'll get copied. If you do go to China and you have a really great product, you'll get copied. It's important to have that legal protection of your IP as a backdrop so that you can protect yourself, you have legal recourse. More importantly, your partner wants to work with you because they have legal recourse. But you're going to get copied whether you go or not if you have something that's really good. So our advice is, if you're going to get copied, it's better to be there first and in a strong position and creating your brand and awareness of your quality rather than get copied and just lose the market opportunity. And there's lots and lots of stories around this, and more people understand now the value of that. That's a purposeful misspelling. Quality isn't good. In actual fact, the quality is getting really good. There are great manufacturers in China, not for all aspects of all devices, but generally speaking, you can get really, really high quality made products in China that meet all the ISO standards, that comply with the US FDA, comply with the Chinese CFDA. And so there are a lot of manufacturers, I don't know what the percentage is, let's say 9 out of 10, where the quality might be questionable, or they're trying to save a little bit of money here or save a little bit of money there and not telling the person that they're making the product for that they've cut corners. But there is absolutely top-level manufacturers in China who make best quality products. Time and cost of entry to get into the market is a concern for a lot of people, and that's a real valid concern. The CFDA and their regulatory process has become more well-defined, but it's also become more rigorous, which may increase your time to market. The cost used to be free, is not free anymore. Now they charge you to do, when I say free, the government fees used to be free. There's still the time and cost for testing and going through the administrative procedures of filing with the CFDA, but now there's also a government cost. I just did something. There we go. Local competition. This is a bigger issue to be concerned about now, more so than ever. So, the Medtronics, the Johnson & Johnsons, et cetera, are all competing in the market, but they're getting more and more local competition. And going back to the changing, the constant change that's going on the market, this is making it a bigger concern and something that you need to take into consideration when you're evaluating the opportunity. So talking about, how do you evaluate the opportunity and what your options are and whether or not it makes sense? So the first is, what's the commercial market in China look like? So there are 1.3 billion people in China, so it's a big market. There are a lot of people who can afford your products. They can afford the highest priced products. The savings rate in China is greater than 25% in the household, primarily for health reasons. So there isn't a safety net in the event that you are sick or injured or ill. The government will quote that they have 95% coverage with healthcare insurance, but that's a very, very low dollar amount. So if you have a real illness and you really need care, you're paying out of pocket. So you pay out of pocket. It's a cash pay. And there are, I would say, probably 25% of the population, which is greater than all of the US population, so more than 300 million people, who have plenty of cash, can pay out of pocket, and it's not an issue for them. If they don't, then they pool their family together, and they'll still afford the procedures. So, commercial market. It's big. There's money to afford. They look for the best quality. They want the best care. Other things that you have to factor in on the commercial assessment, unlike the US, where if you're doing a commercial assessment, a lot of times you look at, well, what's the reimbursement code? How do I price my product to make sure that the market will pay for it? In China, there is not that type of reimbursement decision-making process. In China, you have to look at, can the hospital buy your product and pass the cost on to the patient? It's called a charge code. So if you fit into existing charge codes, great. If you don't, then that's a problem, because the hospital's not going to buy your product if they can't pass the cost on to the patient. And a lot of times, they're happy to pay a higher cost for a product because they can, by law, mark it up 15%, and that's the higher the cost of the product, the more they pass on to the patient, the more money they make. So there's some issues with the way that the healthcare system works, as I mentioned before. This is just an existing fact. CFDA regulatory path. I mentioned before, you have to evaluate whether or not you're going to require a clinical trial in China. With the changing regulations, they now have a Class 3 clinical trial exempt list for Class 3 products that can go in without a clinical trial. If you require a clinical trial, you have to really consider it more in depth, the time and cost to get into the market. They also have a Class 2 list, clinical exempt from clinical trial. And then they have a Class 1 list, so Class 1 products, there's a list of them. If you're Class 1, you just do an administrative filing, so it's very fast to market. So the CFDA process, there's no 510K-like process. It's all the same. It's an administrative process. Could take anywhere from 12 to 15 to 18 months with no clinical trial required. So it is quite a long time investment. A lot of that is just queuing time, waiting in the queue to get reviewed by the inspectors. I wrote imported versus domestic medical device. The reason that I say that is because I would say 3, 4, 5 years ago, we would say if you're a US-made product, you have your FDA approval, which is a requirement, a pre-requirement to go to the China market, then come in as an imported device. Go through the regulatory path, which happens in Beijing. That's where all imported medical devices go through the CFDA registration process. You have a perceived quality, because you're US made. You have a perceived innovation aspect to it. You also can command a premium price. Now, because of the increased regulatory burden for imported devices compared to domestic devices, we typically will say, let's evaluate whether or not you should be a domestic device, domestic Chinese, meaning that you finish the product in the China market. There's more and more companies starting to do that, more and more foreign companies starting to do that. The value of that is if you're Class 1 or you're Class 2, you're registering at the CFDA at the provincial level, so wherever your manufacturing operations are. It's maybe far away from Beijing, less oversight from the central government, faster regulatory path, less expensive regulatory path. If it's Class 3, you still go through at the national level, but you're considered a domestic product, and there might be, they've tried to level the playing field. It used to be really easy for foreign products to come into the market, very hard for domestic. They've totally leveled the playing field, so now there are advantages of evaluating whether or not you should enter the market as a domestic product. On top of that, not unlike the US with a buy US type philosophy, in a lot of other countries they want to buy local. China, they're promoting the same thing, buy local. So they're giving incentives and advantages for hospitals to buy domestic made products. So that might factor into your go-to-market strategy, and it may make sense. Worth evaluating. So the historic norm of going to China is find a distribution partner in China, sign a legal agreement with them that's your distribution agreement for X number of years at X number of transfer price with a committed volume, and then that's the relationship. And you count on them to buy your product, sell your product in the market, et cetera. That's worked for some companies. It's not worked for a lot of companies. On the opposite end of the spectrum, the other way to historically go to China is to create your own organization in China, get your licenses from the government, hire your own employees, and really do it yourself. The multinationals are all on that do-it-yourself. They all have their own large organizations in China, but at the end of the day, still no foreign company is selling directly to the end consumer. So no one's selling directly to the hospitals. The multinationals still have to work with local distributors. So I'm just pointing out those two standard methods of going to the China market as bookends. In between there is a range of different ways to go to the market, where you might decide to partner, not sign a distribution agreement, but you might partner with a strategic, a China strategic, as opposed to a multinational. You might choose to a joint venture, form a structure offshore, commercialize in. There's a number of different ways, I mean, probably a dozen different ways to look at how to consider entering the market other than those two kind of bookends. Control your destiny. This is really hard to do in China, especially if you're here and you don't have your own team in China. There are methods to try to retain as much control and ownership as possible going into the China market. It's not easy to do. At the end of the day, you are going to have to take a leap of faith and put your trust in partners on the ground in China. But to the extent that you can, things like, so when you get a regulatory approval in China, it's not, I'm Acme Medical Device Company in America. Unless I have Acme Medical Device Company in China as a legal entity, I can't control my CFDA registration, right? Because it's to the device, it's not to the manufacturer. So if I don't decide to open my own company in China, then I have to have a third party do that. Every distributor in China is happy to be that third party for you, but you've now given up control and you've given up really your ability to control anything going forward. There are one example is our company. We're a independent company, meaning that we're not a distributor, we're not selling the product, but we're not you, but we're on the ground. We hold licenses for companies so that they can disintermediate that control from distribution partners or strategic partners, et cetera. Just one example of how someone might try to control destiny. If at the end of the day you decide that, hey, we've evaluated the commercial market opportunity, we've evaluated the regulatory path, we think we have a good handle on how we might mitigate some risk, we've found a partner that we want to work with, then I would say start the clock now on your China market entry. Things are changing, they're going to continue to change. One of the things that's very attractive about living and working in China is no day is the same. You might wake up one day and think you have your day dialed in, and you're like, this is going to be a breeze of a day, and everything goes to hell. The next day, you think it's going to be a crappy day, and everything just works, and it's unknowable. It's definitely no Groundhog Days working in China. So with that, I wanted to cover those points, and then I really wanted to open it up for question and answer, because I think that a lot of times people will share concerns with me, which sometimes I find I can help them understand whether that should be a valid concern or not. But other times people will hear things that I say and they want to throw the flag on it and say, you know, that's absolutely not true. I've got experience doing this, and here's my experience. So, you know, I'd like to open it up for questions, please. So the first thing is there's different ways to protect yourself legally in China. You know, so one is filing an international patents, PCT, and then selecting China as a country that you want to cover. So that's one option. The other option is to file directly in China. And a number of companies are choosing to file directly in China. So assuming that you have the legal protection, then if you're in the market yourself, so you've made the investment to go to the market yourself, then you know, you're going to have to, I mean, if someone infringes on your patents, that's not a fun process, regardless of where it is in the world, right? So you have to make the decision whether or not you go after them or not. But but there are judgments being made for both Chinese companies and foreign companies now in China over the last 2-3 years, and the foreign companies have won. So, but I think that's always, you have to evaluate how much money you want to spend defending that, and are there other things that you can do. Typically, if you have a strong partner in China, and when I say strong, I mean one of the better known brand names. An example would be like a Fosun Pharma, big conglomerate. If you're working with them, anyone tries to infringe, they're going to get involved. Your partner will get involved. If you're working with smaller firms, they will still be on the lookout for anyone infringing and bring it to your attention. They might not have the resources to help you. But kind of going back to my earlier comments, the converse of that is if you don't have your IP protected, it's going to be really difficult to find someone that wants to work with you. It's a really good question. It's a very complex answer because it really depends. And some of the things that you have to look at, so I would generalize first by saying that in the China market, some products, they're the highest priced products in the world are in the China market. Other products, they're the most favored nation pricing in the China market. And it really depends on what the category is, who's in the market right now. So if there's nothing else like it, you could command a huge premium. If you're competing against local high quality products, so if you think about like PTA catheters in the market now or stents, the competition is fierce, pricing is coming down, and so you just can't command a premium. But if you've got some innovation and there's nothing like it in the market, you can absolutely command a premium. How long you can command that premium, it really just depends. But the other complexity to it is typically, you're a manufacturer, you're not selling to in the US, you might sell directly to the hospital, right? And so you know your margin. In China, you're selling to your partner, who then is selling to the hospital. And the government is imposing, and you may or may not have read about this, but a two-tier pricing system to try to take waste out of the middle, right? Because a lot of times they'll have middlemen or several levels of middlemen. So they're trying to apply a two-invoice system. So this is my landed price, which goes, or my transfer price, and then there's the price to the hospital, and that's all. So getting back to your question about what's the pricing look like, it might be the highest priced product, higher in China to the hospital than any other country, but your distributor is going to be taking a margin of that. And a lot of times it might be a quite big margin depending on what value they're adding. Yeah. That all comes, yeah, so yeah, I said leap of faith just because it's a scary process, right? Because unless you spend a lot of time there, there's always going to be some unknowns, right? And getting past those unknowns to be able to take that step is challenging. I have to say that, so just from my experience doing this from the early days, so 9 years ago, we started off doing what I call workout, meaning that there was already a relationship that existed. It had gone south. It was a bad relationship, and we were trying to resurrect it one way or the other. In some cases, we found that the bad actor or the one who wasn't complying with what was agreed was on the China side. In some cases, we found it was on the US side. And it wasn't that they were intentionally doing something that was mischievous or in bad faith. They just had there was a breakdown in communication. There was a breakdown in expectations, and one side sends a legal letter to the other side. The Chinese don't like getting letters from lawyers. That's not the way to approach things. The way to generally approach things is to sit down and spend time together and have a meal together and talk through how we resolve. But a lot of US companies we've seen fire off a legal letter saying you're not in compliance with our agreement, and that makes the relationship really bad. So to answer your question, a lot of times I don't think that the Chinese, I think they're looking at it as, hey, this is potentially a really good long-term relationship, and they're coming in it as, hey, we cherish this. If it's a small distributor who's got an innovative product, they're saying, hey, we cherish this opportunity. We're going to pour everything into it. We've seen small distributors spend a lot of money buying product that they didn't really need yet because they hadn't wrapped their sales just to comply with the agreement. which doesn't do anyone any good, right? Because then they're sitting on excess inventory, et cetera. It causes all kinds of challenges. So there are a lot of ways to run into challenges that aren't one side's fault or the other, but they just happen because of that lack of cultural understanding, challenge communicating, misset expectations, et cetera. Kind of along those lines, we think, as Americans, we think in a very linear fashion, very black and white. We have an agreement. We signed the agreement. This is what the agreement says. And on the Chinese side, a lot of times you'll say, you get them looking at it and say, well, yeah, we signed that agreement 3 years ago, and at the time, that absolutely made sense. But now the market's changed. Everything's different. It doesn't make sense anymore. So they're looking at it more, pragmatically, like today is today. Everything's changed. We need to adjust this agreement. And on the U.S. side, we're looking at it as, well, you're renegotiating our agreement. Well, yeah, they are, because everything's changed. And that just is, it's a natural conflict that exists. I know I'm between us and finishing, so thanks everyone for your time. I'm going to hang around for a bit, so if anyone has any questions they want to take offline, I'm happy to answer.